This is Subject to Change, a new collaboration between the Wexner Center for the Arts and WOSU Public Media. My name is Anna Hamilton, and I'm a visual artist, and I'm sitting in my studio in Columbus, Ohio. And in conversation with me today is Anne Bogart, theater director, who is sitting in, I think, your office, Anne, in London.
It's a
Closet.
basement. It's a storage room turned into
Yep.
an office. Because I came here on March 11th, expecting to be here with a small suitcase 1 week, and that's how many months ago?
Yeah. Well, Anne, thank you for joining me. This, just to give a little context, these are conversations between artists. And it's really trying to address the nature of practice. Like, how is it that you come to be able to make the work that you can make? And how do we begin to even articulate and find form in this moment of obvious, enormous change where the world is heaving in so many different ways? And so you are actually the first conversation. So I'm really honored and delighted to have you here. Background for everyone listening is that Anne and I have collaborated in 2 different projects. One was an installation at the Armory in New York City, and more recently a piece that was actually commissioned by the Wexner Center and then later was at UCLA, called The Theater is a Blank Page. And Anne is, I guess I should just give a little background, co-founding director of SITI Company, and a really very unique collaborative theater collective. I think, Anne, maybe there might be other vocabulary you can pitch in there. But also is a writer, and I actually, Anne, as a surprise to you, I have a lot of the books, and one of those books is conversations that Anne has had with people in the theater over many years. And I wanted to begin, Anne, today to just begin with the observation of how I watched you as a director in our project together work, and that I would watch you watching. And I would see you sitting in your chair with what I can only describe as kind of laser focus, working with the actors who share a training process and practice together. And your watching was this kind of form of listening. And I wanted to ask you how you prepare yourself to do that. What is inside that space? And how might you describe that form of attention?
You know, Anne, already you've laid out a 4-hour conversation.
Oh,
Not just this question, but just the way you set up. And I want to answer that in full. But I'm curious about why you said when you set up this conversation just now, you said for now, or this is a collaboration between WOSU and the Wexner. And you said for now or subject to change. That was the word you used. You used the 3 words, subject to change. And I wonder why you said that. And I think it has to do with our conversation, actually.
because that's the name of the series, Subject to Change. Yeah. And
That's so interesting, because I
yeah.
heard it as if you were setting up this program as something subject to change. And I was going to say, how appropriate, because that's actually what we do, right? You know,
Right.
you think of Jasper John's famous words, do something to that, and then do something to that, which is a kind of constant adjustment. So I was interested that you said it. So I think I just want to declare that you found the perfect name for this series. But for somebody like me who didn't know that coming in or didn't pay attention to the emails you sent me, then I thought, oh, it's a good collaboration. Why would it be subject to change? But everything is subject to change, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, now that that's cleared up, I'll answer your
Okay.
question, but you look like you're going to say something.
Oh, because I think that everything that you have done in your practice is how do you prepare yourself to respond to change and to what is actually
Yeah.
happening in front of you.
Well, you know, I spend a very, very long time in preparation mode. Now, you and I, when we prepared together to do The Theater's a Blank Page, we had the great privilege of spending a month on Captiva Island at Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. We were able to do work there, and that's a kind of intensive preparation. And it was really intensive because we sat next to each other and we worked through the entire piece. Of course, all of it changed, but it gave us something to work from.
Right.
Usually I do it on my own. I spend a huge amount of time in research and free association, taking naps where I dream about the thing that I just read. And all that that does is gives me the right to walk in the rehearsal hall. That's
Mhm.
it. It's not like I do all this preparation and then go in and make those things happen. It just gives me the, I can't think of a better word, the right to walk in and be with a group of actors and collaborators and be present. And as you say, and
Mhm.
it's a great compliment how you described how I work, because my job is to be the first audience member. And
Mhm.
that means that I have to be a really, really good audience member. I have to think quickly, be able to feel, to experience. And in the theater, I am the litmus paper in a sense that the actors test what they're doing against. You know, to use an analogy that I probably shouldn't use because it's a little, maybe people will find it a little bit uh, what's the word?
Disingenuous?
No, no, no.
No.
And it's a little,
The,
not disgusting, but just a little
oh,
bit, is that if you think of, you know, the old form of the paper that you pee on to find out if you're pregnant, um, in a way, to use a really awful analogy, I probably shouldn't on a radio program, but I'm going to, is in a sense, I'm the litmus paper and the actors try things out. So they pee on me to see if my color changes. You know, they're actually trying out what they're doing on me, not, and there's a certain moment where I then give it over to an audience. And that's a terrifying moment for me to say, no, you're not performing for me. I have been your practice audience. I've been your first audience. I've tried to be the best audience I can be, to be attentive to you, to respond genuinely, not with thought out ideas from research, but literally in the room and
mhm.
responding. I mean, the same way, you know, when you and I work together in preparation, because, and you come up with pretty insane ideas. Like you'll say, maybe we should have 12 ironing boards. So my job in that moment is also to respond genuinely and
Mhm.
and see if I feel what the French call frisson de corps, or more
Right.
prose like would be goosebumps, you know, that you
Mhm.
are available to the input and your own physical and emotional excitement guides the way, not your prefrontal cortex. So, so to answer your question, I spend a lot of time in preparation, but I don't do that work in rehearsal. And I was
Right.
always happy to hear that probably the most cerebral director of the last 100 years, Richard Foreman said that directing is 100% intuitive. And when I heard him say that, I thought, if he says that,
Mhm.
Mr. Read a billion books and know everything, and Mr.
Mhm.
Philosopher, if he says that, it's
Mhm.
got to be true. And it is true that it
Yeah.
is about being present. It's about breathing. It's about allowing what's happening to change your breath and your heartbeat, and to be discriminating in a way that's full of love.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Anne, because I also, as I listen to you now, I'm thinking about how my first impression was that you weren't directing. You know, because I think we do inherit these stereotypes about what a director does, you know, like as if you arrive with a vision, you know, and then you like direct people to do those things. And it's so the opposite of that. And it, and also it seems that the process that you're describing in terms of your relationship with the actors, that you're this process of really response and making together what you're also asking and inviting the audience into later.
There's a Taoist notion which is about being an like a flagpole steel rod inside surrounded by cotton.
Hmm.
The notion is you can be strong on the inside or you can be strong on the outside, but you can't be strong on the inside and the outside at the same time, which is why bodybuilders have weak souls. They haven't developed an inner strength. So it's very true. If you it's been talked about, and even my company jokes about it. If you came into the room of, say, a SITI Company rehearsal, you'd say,
Right.
"Who's directing this show? Wait a minute,
Yeah.
is it Darren? Who's actually the director here?" Um, I would like to think that the control and the directing is not visible, but is present, and it has to do with something like a determination. But if you see a director who's just shouting at actors and telling them what to do, they're very weak. They don't have an inner strength. So to develop a flagpole on the inside and cotton on the outside, which means you can move, you can change, you can be subject to change at any moment, but have a fierce and strong reason for being in the room. You know, it was Tadashi Suzuki, the great Japanese director, who said, "There's no such thing as good or bad acting, only degrees of profundity of the actor's reason for being on stage," which is a brilliant and frightening thing. I'll say it again, because if there's any actors who listen to this, it's really key, which is there's no such thing as good or bad acting, only degrees of profundity for the actor's reason for being on stage. Now, that's true also for a director. In other words, what counts most is why you're in the room. What are you doing? And that isn't something that you show or you demonstrate. It's a way you are. So it's good to know that directors who are always shouting and trying to control don't have much control. Think of film directors. Think, like, my favorite American film director is Robert Altman, and God rest his soul. And I remember when they used to have DVD extras and they had interviews. I listened to an interview with him, and he said, on a DVD extra back in the days of DVDs and extras, and he said, "Think of any of my films and think of your 5 favorite moments. I can guarantee you they were accidents." And what he did is he gathered together the most talented people he could find, actors, production team, art directors, etc., and then put them together and waited for the accidents to occur and embraced the accidents when they did occur. Now that is control. That is an extraordinary control, because it also involves trust. Then you brought up the audience, which is really key in this conversation, is that an audience can sense, not intellectually or logically, but an audience will know if you trust them and if you're giving them space. One of the amazing things that you did at the Armory with the event of a thread, which I love that you say we collaborated on it. It was really a huge vision of yours. We really collaborated on Theaters of Blank Page. But in terms of event of a thread, I had something to do, I had a little piece of the pie. But to see the agency that was granted the audience is so inspiring to me, because there's nothing else we want in life except to be given agency, be given space, to be given credit for having a brain, for being able to put things together. You know, that's another thing I learned from you in Blank Page, is that you would just say things like, "Let's see if the audience can move without us telling them to." You know, and I go, "No, we have to have somebody making a speech." And you're like, "No, maybe if we pass them cards." And it was a great lesson to me working with you, was to trust the audience even more. I mean, I thought it was a pretty trusting person, and also to trust duration, which is another thing I learned and continue to learn with you.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I think that was a space that neither of us would have made on our own, you know, so,
True.
and that's what really it makes a true collaboration. But you're talking about trust. You're also talking about risk, and you're talking about, I think, recognition. because you have to be able to recognize that something is happening. And, you know, if I can circle back to thinking about, well, how do you prepare yourself to, as you say, wait for the accidents, which is really so much a part of my practice as well. Like you
Mhm.
set up a structure or a field or a condition within which something can happen, and that needs to have preparation and discipline. But you want to then completely let go of determining what it is that will actually happen. And the balance then between, you know, enough structure so that the accidents can happen and total chaos or just nothing, you know, is maybe the art. I don't know.
And the progenitor of that kind of thinking is, of course, John Cage.
Mhm.
You know, you say, well, he would constantly give up control, but ultimately he never did, because he controlled, as you say, the conditions in which
Mhm.
something happens
Mhm.
very exactly. So
Mhm.
there has to be a balance between um, uh, what's controlled or what's decided and what is open.
Mhm.
And I think if a work has too much control, it doesn't have any life.
Right.
And if it has too much openness, you can't tell what the hell's going on. It's just
Mhm.
confusing.
Mhm.
So you need that balance and make sure the control has a very strong core.
Like light hands, right? Like how
Yeah,
you hold something, right?
yeah,
How you hold it. Do you, this way, this way.
yeah. How you're holding space for
Yes.
other people. Certainly, I think as a theater director too.
I mean, and you use the metaphor of the, you know, the steel rod and the cotton surround, uh, and that you prepare with research. Can you say anything more about what allows you to stand and be present?
Well, it's not just
Yeah,
the particular project that prepares you, it's your life. I mean,
yeah.
one has to set up a life in which you're training for that, you know. Um, in my own case, there's certain things that I do on a daily basis which give me stability because they test my balance. For example, I mean, my own study of Tai Chi Chuan and earlier Aikido, which is all about imbalance and balance and imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, the actors in SITI Company with their training and Suzuki training and viewpoints, it's all about welcoming the state of imbalance, because the art happens in a moment when you're out of balance and you're striving to find balance from a state of imbalance. So you have to welcome the imbalance, and then the adventure is the attempt to find balance from a state of imbalance. I mean, even in our working together, we would throw ourselves off balance by just having impossible things that were just,
Mm-hmm.
people would look at us and think we're crazy. But in that attempt to find some sort of stability, the art lies there. It's not on the stability you find, and it's not in the imbalance, it's in the attempt. So one has to practice every day
Mm-hmm.
um, to, to welcome imbalance, to enjoy the surfing that happens as the waves change form, subject to change
Yeah.
again.
Well, and I'm sure that that actually translates very directly to where this condition we find in the world right now, right? That in terms of balance and imbalance and this incredibly uncomfortable space that
Yeah.
is also exhilarating, that we are recognizing, finding, I think, trying to respond to. Um,
Yeah. We're in a state of rupture at this moment.
mm-hmm.
As you know, I'm working on a book called The Art of Resonance, because I'm interested in the idea of what the theater does or art does is creates a resonant experience. And the question is, how do you do that? And I was talking to Leon Inglesrud, who's a co-artistic director of SITI Company, who's my friend and philosopher. And he said, you know, people don't care about resonance when they're off, when they're this disturbed, where the crack has been, people are falling through and tumbling. Um, and I think it's very true. Now, I would say from my own observations here in London, because I came here right as the shutdown started on March 11th, I watched how my colleagues and people in the theater field desperately tried to send out signals. And they did it online via coronavirus dances and endless readings and putting out and putting out. And at first it really bugged me. I thought it's all self-expression, and that's not what we need to do. Is we need to listen now. And two things came out of that. One, I stopped being so judgmental of everybody who was doing that when my dear friend Tina Landau said, "Oh, Anne, that's the way they're mourning. That's what they're doing because they're in mourning." But the thing that I was thinking about a lot is I started thinking about prisoners of war and how, you know, even you and I are talking to each other in these little boxes, and we're like in a cell, different cells. And during the Second World War and the Vietnam War, the prisoners of war figured out a way of knocking on each other's cells, and they weren't allowed to relate to one another, but they would knock, and they figured out a code, and they started passing information, and that prisoner would pass it to the next person, to the next person. And it was not only about passing information, but it was also about keeping a sense of togetherness.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm more interested in that right now. I'm interested in how we knock to each other and see what's coming back and see how we adjust to that, and then knock again. That we're sending, it's not, I'm not interested in self-expression, which I think is a lot of self-expression out of desperation, or as Tina Landau would say, out of mourning, but how we are trying to send signals to one another from our various places,
Mm-hmm.
situations, circumstances, or as you use the word conditions, we're each in a certain condition. Some people are out marching, some people are out screaming, some people are setting off fireworks, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we talk to each other, and how do we move forward?
Mm-hmm.
And that takes a great deal of civic attention. You know, I think finally it's become clear to everybody that the wrong words we've been using is social distancing, because we've not been socially distanced at all. We've been incredibly communicative with one another. We do have physical distance, which is different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to go from a sort of horizontal awareness in space to a vertical awareness in space to a horizontal one, where we care for the space in between us.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I met a young undergraduate student at the New School a couple of years ago, and I was talking about politics, and he said, "Anne, why don't you use the words intentional civics?" And I said, "Oh, that's great. Intentional civics. What do you mean by that?" And he said, "Well, intentional civics is where you don't care about the psychologies of particular people. You take care of the space in between."
Yeah.
And I thought that was gorgeous. And I said, "Well, where did you get that?" And he said, "I made it up." And I found out, I looked afterwards online, I couldn't find anybody else who's using the term intentional civics. And it's a beautiful notion of how we become civic with one another now.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the question, you know, I mean, certainly in the theater is about, its subject is about how we get along. How can we get along better? And
Well,
so, yeah.
and I think that, I mean, it makes me think a lot about the project, obviously, at the Armory, because it was really, the whole thing for me in many ways was this choreographing the space so that people could be together and also be alone. And everything was about those spatial relations. And that's obviously, and that's structured so many of your theater productions. But I'm curious right now about this question of civic attention and the actual theater itself as a space, because across the world there are these enormous civic public institutions that are silent and shuttered, and there's no one on the stage and there's no one in the seats, and that has been a given condition for theater. And, you know, when I was beginning to think about that, I was thinking about your early history doing really non-theater site related projects. And I was also thinking of the think it's a speech or an article that Peter Sellers wrote talking about the amphitheater as a giant ear carved in the earth for listening.
It's
And
beautiful.
this invitation to listen to people not like the people sitting in the seats. And that this is the first condition of theater. And with things delayed, canceled, etc., I'd love to hear how you're thinking about the actual space of the theater, where we find it now in this condition. If
Yeah,
and
and you know, one of the reasons I reached out to you a couple of weeks ago is to say the theater is a blank page, is a love story to sort of Renaissance style theater. Renaissance style theater doesn't mean it's from the Renaissance. It's most of our theaters are Renaissance style. It's the ones with the
with the
proscenium arch and
steps and the
the wings and the traps and the, you know, and we made a piece that was in a sense that was the poetry was expressed through that means. Now it means something even more extraordinary, and exactly as you say, they're lying empty. And one of the things that I think about all the time is that every theater, and you might know this, you probably do, every theater right now, all those empty theaters, in the middle of the stage, there's a lamp.
Mhm.
And it looks like, you know, a lamp in somebody's house. And it's called a ghost light. And
Right.
it's there by law. And it's one of the most beautiful metaphors and beautiful objects I've ever known in my life. I'm very moved by the idea of a ghost light. When people aren't there, this light is there. Now, you could say, oh, it's the union rule so that people don't hurt themselves when they come in. There's at least a light. They're not walking into a completely dark stage. But the idea of these thousands and thousands and
Mm,
thousands of theaters around the world right now that have these ghost lights, one ghost light sitting
mm,
there on the middle of the stage. And probably if the lamp goes out, they're going to have to go in because of union rules and put a new
mm.
light bulb in. Um, so that's why I wanted us to rethink, to think about a way to evoke these theaters in
Mhm.
a different kind of love letter to these
Mhm.
Renaissance theaters in a sense. That said, when you walk into a movie theater, I don't know if you feel this with me like I do, and it's half empty, I am delighted. I'm so happy. And if it's one third, you know, if there's only one quarter of the audience there, I'm even happier. If
Mhm.
there's three people there, I feel I can spread out and it's the best experience.
Mhm.
If I walk into a theater for a production and it's empty, I'm so disappointed
Mhm.
that you don't, that the theater is about how you go through something together with other people. So the notion of the plans, the safety plans that have been made, where people arrive and there's three seats in between them, is tragic, unless it's used very consciously. Now I remember, and I'm going back to a film notion, but I actually mean it for the theater. I was working in San Diego years and years ago when the movie Platoon came out, the one about Vietnam. And I went to see it in a Cineplex, in a small theater. It was like a lot of theaters, and I went in. It was pretty crowded, and I sat through the film. I was there alone, and it was devastating. It was beautiful, and I remember Barbara's Adagio played, and at the end, I was very taken by it. And so I sat for a while. I didn't get up to leave right away, and people were getting up to leave. And when I finally got up to leave, I started walking out. And this is about Vietnam and loss. And there was a seat, one seat, that had a black plastic garbage bag
Mm,
over it. And I burst into tears. And I
mhm.
thought, oh my God, all around the world when they're playing Platoon, every theater is going to have one seat with a plastic bag over it to symbolize the lost person who died. Of course, you know, it was a broken seat and they probably put a plastic bag over it because they didn't want somebody to sit in it. So my imagination was completely wrong. But the meaning of that empty seat was so profound. So one question is, if we are going to go inside, which is dangerous right now, I mean, the most dangerous thing is breathing common air. And we always say the theater is about breathing common air. Breathing common air is now highly dangerous. If there's a way to make the spaces and the emptiness significant, that's something.
Mm-hmm.
The other option is doing things out of doors, which is my whole training in theater. Since I couldn't get a theater, I did everything site specific. There was no word of site specific or immersive in those days, but I did it. And that's certainly something. I've noticed also that with my directing students, I teach directing at Columbia with graduate directing, and the students are talking about something which is very interesting, which is both worldwide, meaning we have this connection with each other through the internet and through Zoom, which is really connecting people. But they're also talking about staging little things in parks all over Brooklyn, say, or because they're in New York, that only people see. And I find it really interesting that they're thinking of these little things and then this vast reach. I'm not sure where that's going to go. And I certainly don't have a solution. But what's remarkable is the meaning of everything has changed. Every play means something different. Theater's a blank page means something different. We recently, as a company, SITI Company, we did an in-depth, deep read of Thornton Wilder's Skin of Our Teeth, which is a play that is funny and tragic at the same time. It's about the apocalypse. It was written in 1941 or 38. Anyway, I got the year wrong. It is all about our current moment. It is so relevant right now. It's terrifying and also quite wonderful. But it's created by the lens through which we're looking. So your question I don't have an answer to, but I just have a lot of thoughts about.
Well, and I think two things kind of in response. I think this impulse to do something live for a maybe much more intimate setting, whether that's 5 people, sitting in their front yard or in a park. I was talking to Ann Carlson, and she has made the back of her truck a dance platform, and she can take it around and she can dance and perform in different places in Los Angeles. And that just struck me as being, incredibly ingenious and wonderful to come across that. But I also think that there's this impulse towards the local, right? Toward, like, at the same time that we have this extension through the screen and through the media, it's like to be acting in some way, in multiple ways, on what is close at hand, what we actually can perhaps affect, where we might be able to make some small difference. And as you talk about reading the Thornton Wilder, one of the questions I had coming into this is like how you choose the stories, the material you want to work with. Because, the material we worked together with was Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And I think people had a lot of questions about why are you reading that text at this time? And for some people, they found their way into seeing the way in which it was contemporary, and other people didn't. But, I'm thinking about, you direct in opera, you worked with SITI Company, you work with a lot of young directors at Columbia, and your how you see the material you're already working with is obviously now through a different lens. But as you think about projects that you might want to pursue, what's coming up for you?
Well,
or what stories, I guess, what
certainly
stories?
Skin of Our Teeth. When I read it, I said, now that means something. But it's interesting that you bring that out, because just yesterday on Zoom, in an artistic leadership meeting for SITI Company, the question of what do we do once we can?
Exactly.
And because of the Black Lives Matter movement, and about how white privilege and white fragility has to be seen for what it is very difficult for SITI Company to even conceive of doing any play right now, because it all seems, because it's a predominantly white company, although we invite a lot of people of color and different backgrounds and international come and work with us, it is, at its core, it was founded by white people. And so nothing feels right now to the company.
Mm-hmm.
My feeling is you just have to dive in, choose something, dive in, and then deal with what it means in the world right now. It's not going to be easy, but you'll find out as you work on it. But I think there's a terror of choosing material, because what material speaks correctly, doesn't put things in the wrong light.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of the dramatic material is right now questionable to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we talked about is, but not right away because it's a little too obvious, but it's something we've done for the last 10 years a lot, which is to collaborate with BIPOC companies, with and that's one option.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very tricky. I'm very interested in a piece that's would be called Behavior in Public Places, based on the book by Erwin Goffman, who is a
Oh,
sociologist. And in the book, he categorized all forms of human interaction into, I can't remember if it's 14 or 17 different category ways that people can be together. And I thought we should do this out of doors with amazing music, use the text of Goffman. It's kind of a dance piece about how people get along. We started working on it in the Zoom room, where each person made a solo based on a piece of music by John Adams, a new piece he's written. And it got really interesting when we put them together. And that I'm excited by.
yeah, because it's really because how we socially interact in our, like, as you say, civic attention right now,
Yeah.
and how we attend to this space and the form of address, and how we make that space now.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to return that. It also raises a question for me about narrative and abstraction, because I think about partly your work in the opera, or working with classical texts, Greek texts that I know you've worked with. It's like or I mean, I think the first production I saw was The Medium and Marcia McLuhan, which
Yeah.
is like I'd never seen anything like it. I was like the moth to the flame. Like, who are these people? What is SITI Company? Who is this Anne Bogart? But I think I've had a lot of questions about, like, what is the vocabulary we need to address this place that we find ourselves in? Do the stories exist? Do they need to be remade? How do they need to be remade? What are the forms that can speak to us now, and what can abstraction do? So the simple demonstration of how two people walk together can be also like that plastic bag in the theater.
Mm.
It's like, because we all come to experience things through the lens of the world that we're inhabiting. And so I think there's a simplicity that is gestural and spatial that might be more abstract or without linear narrative, that might be able to address the feeling space of where we are.
What that makes me think is, if it's through that kind of abstraction, people can read their own lives into it.
Mm-hmm.
So that we're not telling them a story about this, but it's the way as I imagine behavior in public places, if each actor makes the choreography on their own, then when you bring them together in outdoor space, I'm imagining an outdoor space, the coincidences. So
Mm-hmm.
if you decide on this note in the John Adams piece, you turn your head to the left, and somebody else decides they're turning the head the other way, they're suddenly looking at each other. And so what
Right.
does that mean? So I think there's a lot of potential in that, but it's, I think all the questions you just asked, I'm half wanting to ask you, can you answer any of your own questions? Or,
Of course not.
but I'm also realizing that that we're in a moment of rupture and transition, and the questions are maybe more important than the answers right now.
Well, because the questions maybe are the way to just circle back as we kind of maybe wrap this up, is the questions are where what you prepare yourself to come and stand there, right?
Well, that's, going back to your early question about preparation, I forgot that. And that is the basic
Mm-hmm.
element, is that you come into the room with a question.
Mm-hmm.
And the question, the profundity of the question is really the key. And I work with a group of people who can top that, because I'll come into the room with a question and we'll work on it. We'll come up with something. I'll say, what is it? And we'll come up with something. And then they'll say, yeah, but what is it really? And I'll want to say, damn it, we just came up with an answer to that question. And then we work on it more and it's deeper. Here it is. But what is it really? And you keep asking that question, and it's deep.
Well, and because in fact it's that form of address, like to circle back to what you're saying about the audience and the intelligence of the audience, is that you leave the theater or a production potentially, or an experience, with a question, not with an answer.
Yeah, definitely.
And the capacity to be trusted with that question, and to I think we do live in a culture that I think in so many ways approaches art like as if it's something you're supposed to get, like as if there's an answer, and it's like, it's that, and maybe that brings us around to resonance and the art of resonance, which is the book that you're working on right now. And it's that the work dwells within you long after you've actually been in the experience, and it might haunt you with pleasure, with uncomfortableness, with dissatisfaction, but it's like how we hold those things both in our process and in the things we make, that actually maybe are what prepare us to be present. um,
You just gave me an idea, because you were framing it in a new way, about what resonance is, in that it extends through time. It remains with you. And you just gave me an idea, because I've been thinking a lot about this notion. And you talked about making work for less people. It's a term that I didn't make up. It's called revolutions in small rooms.
mm,
And that really interests me, is that, you go into a rehearsal room, you take care of the circumstances of the room, the politics of the room. You create something that is imbued with that qualitative social system that you've created in rehearsal, and it goes out, and an audience sees it. They see the way people are behaving together. I think when you first saw the medium, you were seeing the way the actors were together, which is unusual. And they were proposing a different way to be together,
mm-hmm.
which was more horizontal, less vertical, perhaps. But I was thinking that, there was a great theater director named Joe Chaikin. He had a company called the Open Theater. I came in right at the end of, came into being an adult right at the end of their very successful run. But they made these extraordinary pieces that were small, definitely revolutions in small room. They definitely toured around the world, but it was a select group of people who saw this work that was about them. And Joe Chaikin would ask a question like, what does it mean to die? And they would then work on that. And they came up with a piece called Terminal. What is Adam and Eve? They came up with a piece called The Serpent, quite a famous one. And I think, I'm pretty convinced that a chorus line, the big hit on Broadway, would not have happened without the Open Theater. I'm sure that Michael Bennett, who directed Chorus Line, which was a whole new way of making theater, which was about the actors on the stage, it was about people, it was a different kind of dramaturgy. I'm sure he went to see the work of the Open Theater. and that it resonated with him. And so that resonance happens not always through the same people. It sort of, it moves out into the world. It causes revolutions, but you start in a small kernel. It's what you do in this small place that causes resonance. And so I've decided, thanks for reminding me, I'm going to write about that now.
Well, and you can't account for where it ends up, right? Like that
No.
that every person intersects with it in a different way, and it intersects their life, and actually, you just have to trust that, and you have to trust that that actually has a kind of power that's very different than the kind of power we tend to identify.
Yeah.
Maybe one.
That's true.
Yeah, one kind of last question, Anne, is I've always been really interested in the fact that you write a blog, like for all the things that you're doing, teaching, directing, multiple projects, that the writing is a place where maybe for thinking in a different way than the making of the work. And that I think you had said when we were working together on the Theater's a Blank Page that that's how the books get written, because you have the discipline of real deadlines that you give yourself for the blog posts. And I guess I'm sort of making a plug for people to be reading them.
Go to SITI.org, go to my
Yeah.
company. Yeah, yeah.
And so I don't know if you want to say anything about that relation.
Well, it is a trick. It's a way of keeping writing. Now,
Yeah.
I'm a theater director because if I didn't have this date of opening or the date of the first rehearsal or of this meeting with the fundraiser, with the foundation, I would just lie around and do nothing.
Yeah.
I need a crisis. And the blogs for me give me a monthly crisis. And every month somebody in SITI Company writes to me and says, I'm so sorry to bother you, Anne, but that blog is due soon. I always write back, say, thank the Lord you bugged me, because, I've been avoiding it. So it really is a trick. And because blogs are such a cliche these days, I make sure that it's really well written. So I give it to Rena, my other half, who's a very sharp editor, and she reads it and gives me vicious notes. So I make sure it's well written. And so right now I have a lot of material to move around and add more to, but without those deadlines, I'd never be able to write a book.
Yeah. Well, and I think that what's so challenging about this time is that deadlines have been suspended. And so the necessity of a deadline, the panic, the as you say, the crisis of a deadline, is that without those, where is the energy, that is motivating thoughts being articulated, things coming to form. And so, we have to make them up.
Yeah.
Can I just end with this, because this is
It's a
book.
great cover, isn't it?
It's a great cover.
I found it. I was in the Victoria and Albert Museum walking through the gift shop, and I saw that picture was on I was working on the book, and that picture was on a postcard, and I grabbed it. And
Right.
I said, that's it.
Yeah, because
Anyway,
you look at this and you can really feel what that must feel like, right? But I want to read, it says, and then you act, making art in an unpredictable world. And it's almost like you knew subject to change was always going to be, in fact, our condition.
Yeah.
So
more so than ever now.
More so, yeah. And thank you so much for joining me today. And
it's a pleasure, and always a pleasure talking with you.